In this video, I want to talk about references. We have used argument of the function as a reference on quite a few occasions now, but I'd like to cover this topic a little bit more. So on php.net, in a search, let's simply type references and hit enter. This will take us to the references explained page, and we are going to first have a look at what references do. If we click on this one and have a read, there are three basic operations performed using references: assigning by reference, passing by reference, and returning by reference. This section will give an introduction to these operations with links to further reading. And there we go, we have assign by reference. The first one, in the first of these, PHP references allow you to make two variables refer to the same content. Meaning when you do A equals and end symbol, then B, it means that A and B point to the same content. Let's quickly have a look at all this in the editor. If we start with the variable A and we assign integer 10 to it, and then what I'm going to do is use B equals end symbol A. You can also write this as this end symbol next to the variable. It doesn't really matter. It works exactly the same way. And then what I'm going to do is A equals 20. So I'm basically overwriting the value associated with variable A. And as you can see here, we associated the value associated with variable A with the B by reference. So it's basically referencing what's happening with this A variable. And now what I'm going to do, first of all, let's echo this A variable. And then we're going to echo B variable as well. And let's save it, preview it in a browser, refresh the page. Both of them are 20, as you can see. Even though this association here was done before we updated, before we overwritten the A variable. But because it's basically associated by reference, that means whatever happens to this A variable anywhere within this file, you have to update the variable B as well. And just to make sure that it's exactly the same one, it's precisely the same value, what we're going to do is use var dump, and what we're going to do is use the expression A triple equal symbol B to make sure that it's exactly the same. It's basically identical, as you may remember, triple equal symbol. And if we save it and preview it in a browser, refresh the page, boolean true, means they're exactly the same thing. So if we update it again, if we change it to a, let's say, string, for instance, it doesn't have to be the same data type. If we save it, refresh the page, it's still identical. So B now returns the same string. So if I echo B and semicolon, if we refresh the page, there we go, you also have string. Whatever has been assigned to the A variable, whatever this A variable value has been changed to, will also change on a B variable. Let's go back to the browser and read on. Then we have this note: A and B are completely equal here. A is not pointing to B or vice versa. A and B are pointing to the same place. Basically, whatever value is associated with A that's the same value for B, basically. So they pointing to the same place, in other words, as it says here in this note. And then we have, if you assign pass or return an undefined variable by reference, it will be created. That's a pretty interesting one. So as you can see, this example here about function for, we referencing variable, the argument var, and then we are calling this for function without actually variable A being anywhere defined, first of all, instantiated. And as it says here, this node, A is created and assigned to null. Let's quickly have a look at the same example in the editor. So let's now create function for, and let's pass the argument var by reference. And what we're going to simply do is return incremented by 1, pre-incremented, basically, this argument. And then echo for, and let's associate variable. Let's pass through the variable A. As you can see, we haven't instantiated this A variable anyway. We haven't actually created this variable anyway. So if we save it, preview it in a browser, refresh, there's no error, there's just one. So basically, by default, this A, when we pass it through without actually having this defined anywhere, was set to null, and then we pre-increment it by 1 and return it straight away. This is why it gave us 1, because it was null, obviously. Plus 1 is 1. But what's going to happen now, I can also use this A independently. Have a look at this. Even though I haven't defined it anywhere, because I pass it as a reference to the function, it has automatically been created in the scope in which I'm actually operating, which is in the global scope here. So if we save it, preview it in the browser, there we go. We have two A's because first one is returned directly from this function and the other one is available because of this variable which has been created. And if I now try and echo the same thing again, save it, refresh the page, we get 2, because second time around here when I call this function, this variable was already defined because of this first call. So we just pass it as a reference. The value of this variable was already 1 from this first call, and obviously that's been incremented by 1, which gave us 2, and now both of these are obviously returning true. That's why the result in the browser. Let's now go back to the documentation, and if we scroll up, and this time we are going to the section passing by reference. You can pass a variable by reference to a function, so the function can modify the variable. The syntax is as follows, and we have been using this on several occasions, but let's give it a try again. So if we go back to our editor, let's remove everything we have here, and we are going to start with the function. Let's call it foo again, and we pass in the argument as by reference here. So again, end symbol obviously, and this argument called var, and then what we are going to do is simply increment it by 1. So we can post increment it now, it doesn't really matter because we're not returning anything from this function, so that's fine. And then we go for the variable called a, and we assign the value 5 to it, the integer, and then we call this function and we pass this variable through as an argument. Now what I'm going to do is echo this variable a, and if we save everything and preview it in the browser, it's pretty much the same example as within this documentation. It gives us 6, so that was pretty easy. Now let's try again. Foo a again, we call in this function again, and echo a again. What do you think we're gonna get this time? If we refresh the page, we have 7. So the first time when we echo that result was 6. Next time 7, and as many times as we're going to call this function, the value basically will be incremented. So we can obviously do it like this, and just do it multiple times, save it, and if we preview it in a browser now, it's 10. So that's how the most basic reference example works. So if we go back to the editor, to the documentation, let's have a look at a few notes that we have here. There is no reference sign on a function call, only on function definitions. That means that obviously when we are calling the function, we don't have to put end symbol here, and I'm just going to go to the editor. So basically when we call in the function, we don't have to put this end symbol. It's only on a definition. So let's go back to the browser. Then we have function definitions alone are enough to correctly pass the argument by reference. As of PHP 5.3, you will get a warning saying that call time passed by reference is deprecated when you use end in foo and then obviously the argument when we are calling this specific function. And as of PHP 5.4, call time passed by reference was removed. So using it will raise a fatal error, which is what we just explained basically with this first sentence, that you shouldn't be using end when you're actually calling the functions, only when you define them. So if we go back to the browser, and then we have the following things can be passed by reference. Variables, so we can pass variable as we did in the previous example. Then new statements, foo, and then new foo bar, which will basically represent objects, classes. Again, this is outside of the scope of this first series. References returned from functions, i.e., and there's an example here. We have a function, we pass in argument as a reference, pretty much what we did in the previous example. And then we have another function, but this time have a look at this symbol here. This symbol, this end symbol is before the function. So we are basically, in order to pass the function as the reference so that it works like a variable, then we have to prepend this end symbol to the function itself. So basically this value will then be used as a reference inside of this function. Let's have a look at a few other examples in the editor. So if we go back and remove everything we have here, let's start with a function Actually, I could have kept this function because we're going to use the same function. So end, and we go for var argument. And what I'm going to do is simply use this var plus plus post incremented. And now we are going to go for this function, and we are going to make sure that this function returns a reference. So bar name for the function, and then we put the reference to the argument value. So basically we are going to be passing whatever argument we are going to be passing to this function will be passed by reference, meaning that it's going to be updated outside of the function as well. So if we now start with the value equals, and what I'm going to do is just do a simple conditional statement. Value is more than 2. Then what I want to do, question mark, if it's true, return -1. If it's not, return 1. So that's what the value is going to be after this condition has been evaluated. And now let's return this value. So return value. Now you might be wondering, why didn't I put all this this entire expression here for the return statement? Well, you will find out in just a moment because we're going to tackle this as well. So let's start with the variable a equals 10, and now I'm calling this foo function, and I'm passing the bar function with the a variable as an argument. So if we now echo a, what do you think is going to happen? If we go to the browser, refresh the page, we have 0. Now why do we have 0? Because this bar function will only return either -1 or 1 based on whether the value we are passing through is more than 2. If it is, then it will be -1, otherwise it will return 1. So basically whatever you pass through, it's either going to be -1 or 1. And we pass in the result of this function as a reference to this foo function. So this one increments whatever we pass in, whatever this one is returning, by 1, and updating obviously the variable in the global scope here. So what's going to happen is -1 plus 1 is going to give us 0. 1 plus 1 is going to give us 2. These are the only two basically returned values that we can get from this whole setup here. So this is what we did, but I told you that we did it this way because why didn't we actually do this? Let's have a look what this is going to produce. Refresh the page, and there we go. Only variable references should be returned by reference. And what that means basically is that when we are returning the value from the function that is going to be used as a reference, and this end symbol indicates that it will, it cannot return the expression. It has to be just the variable. So that's why if we, let's say, were to add 1 to this variable, that's also an expression. That's not just a variable, that's expression, because we are adding to variable basically. This is an expression. So if we save it, we will get exactly the same error. As you can see, only variable references should be returned by reference. So we cannot put the expression when we are returning reference. If we return a value just like this, if we go back to the browser, everything works just fine. Obviously, it doesn't do what we want to do. So if we just copy this back and assign it to our value again, there we go. Now the functionality stays as it was before. So remember, you cannot return expressions as a reference basically from the function which is to be used as a reference. Now another thing is that we have to have this reference here. We cannot just pass this function to this foo function and hope that the standard function like this will work with it, because it won't. And usually you work with the variables, and variables don't need this when we calling them, as we just explained earlier. But when you use it with a function, this function definition has been preceded by this end symbol. If I save it and preview it in the browser, now you see the error again, as strict standards, only variables should be passed by a reference. Now this message doesn't quite tell us that it's a function name that hasn't been preceded with the end symbol for the reference within another function, but obviously when you look at the line 21 as it indicates, it will become more obvious that obviously this might be the problem. So just so you remember, if any of the functions that you're going to be passing through as an argument require the argument to be referenced, then if it's a function, it has to be preceded by this end symbol as well. Otherwise, it's not going to work with the argument which is supposed to be passed through as a reference. Now we can obviously copy all this override the variable, call it again, and let's just preview everything. Actually, before we preview everything in the browser, let's change this to say 1 this time. And if we preview it in a browser, refresh, this time we get 2. As I said earlier, it's only going to return either 0 or 2. Now let's get back to our documentation and scroll down a little bit. And let's read on. We have no other expressions should be passed by reference as the result is undefined. For example, the following examples of passing by reference are invalid. And there we go. This is pretty much what we've just tried. There's missing the and symbol, and it obviously produced a problem when we call this function foo, which requires the argument to be passed as reference, and obviously function can only be passed as reference if it has this and symbol at the beginning. Then expressions cannot be passed by reference either, so that won't work. Just the standard values like integers, strings, obviously they will also cause a problem. So obviously this cannot be done. If we associated value with a variable and pass it through as a reference, then yes, it would work, but it has to be done outside of the call to the function itself. We would have to go before the function and then just pass the a variable as an argument.